You've been lied to about mobility, and I bet you believe at least one of the myths. In this video, I'm going to break down the top 5 mobility myths that are holding you back and why you should stop believing them. I clearly remember the first time I came across the word mobility. It was when Kelly Starrett's book, Becoming a Supple Leopard, came out. Funnily enough, I'd been in the industry for a while and had never really come across the word mobility before then. And I was quite intrigued to read this book about mobility and how we shouldn't be stretching. And oddly, it was a book of stretches. And obviously I'd come across the word mobility because mobility just means movement, right? But it seemed that this word had become hijacked and become this fitness industry thing really out of nowhere. The problem is the industry started to develop this idea of mobility versus stretching. And I'm sure you've heard, you might have even used this apparent definition that mobility is active and stretching is passive. And this really, I don't even know where this came from. I see it quoted a lot, but it just kind of grew out of thin air. The thing is, stretching can be active as well. We have a range of different types of stretching. So stretching can be passive, and in that passiveness, it can be static or dynamic. The same as it can be active static, active dynamic. So if you ever sat in a deep squat, that's an active stretch. And I can see where this came from, this idea that if we want to improve movement, we should be moving, and that's certainly the case. But nothing improves range of motion, research proven, as much as stretching. And in my system, we do progress through a lot of different range types of stretching techniques. And what some would class as mobility, which really is dynamic stretching, is definitely in that system. It's a phase 2 strategy, but they all have their place and they all favor different adaptations. So it's certainly not a case of mobility is active and stretching is passive. There's a range of different types of stretching, and I'm pretty keen for us to drop that myth. I remember teaching a workshop, and one of the students in the workshop asked me, what's the point of stretching anyway? It's just temporary. We were looking at a pec stretch, and I came into an exercise where I had the pec stretch with a band, and I said, what about doing this? And he said, that's just relaxing your muscles. It's just a temporary change. And I said, what about if I do this? And I held a dumbbell. Suddenly that student wasn't quite as sure. For some reason, this addition of a dumbbell made him think maybe it's not such a temporary change. And the thing is, your body doesn't know the difference. Your body's just responding to load. Whether I'm holding a stretch on the wall, I'm holding a band, or I'm using a dumbbell, these are all different strategies of creating tensile load in the muscles. It just comes down to how hard I can push, or whether or not I use my internal concept of creating load, or I use an external force such as a dumbbell to create even more load than I can probably create on my own. And one of the core principles of Stretch Yourself Strong, as you can probably imagine, is adding some sort of load to our stretches. When we do this, research has shown that we do create permanent change in the muscles, and that's certainly one of the goals of my system. So stretching, if we are just going to relax into a position, it certainly is temporary, and it's probably going to last minutes to hours, and it's certainly going to need to do it on a daily basis. But the goal should be adding enough intensity so not only do we get more results in our flexibility gains, but we get strong through them and we create some sort of permanent tissue adaptation. As a young athlete, I remember being told I shouldn't stretch before I train because I was going to lose all my gains as a result. So it's definitely something I dropped, and I'm sure it's something that many people have dropped because they've been told the same. As I became further immersed into this niche, I dug into it a little bit more, and it's not as clear cut as you would think. So yes, early research did show that stretching before some types of training did decrease strength and power. So for example, one study looked at vertical jump. Stretching before vertical jump reduced vertical jump height. But they held those stretches for anywhere up to an hour, and I've never seen someone sitting in the gym holding a stretch for an hour or before they're going to go out and play a sport. So I think that's very far removed from real life. Subsequent research also looked at shorter durations, around a minute or so, and also showed that around a minute can, in some instances, reduce power. However, if you're going to do that stretch and then follow up with some sort of dynamic activity, any of those negative effects or potential negative effects of that stretch are gone. But also in real life, we don't really see people holding a stretch for a minute at the gym or before sport anyway. It's usually jump onto the edge of a machine, hold something for as long as you can respond to a text, and then we're done. So if you're doing stretches of less than a minute and you're following it up with some sort of activity, you certainly aren't going to see any negative results from that stretching. So stretching is definitely something that you can do and should do before a workout where it's needed and targeted. And we will talk about that again in a moment. One of my old training partners used to spend anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes stretching after a training session. And I recall catching up with him often the next day, and In hindsight, he really didn't seem to fare any better than what I did, and I wasn't stretching after training. And as it turns out, stretching after training doesn't help your recovery. In fact, it might even slow your recovery down. Remember in my earlier point, I mentioned that stretching with enough intensity is going to elicit some sort of muscle change. Well, that muscle change comes from muscle damage, the same as when we're training a muscle in any other way. So logically, muscle damage isn't going to be the thing that's going to help you recover. But people still do this, and it's probably because at the time stretching feels quite good, but we are going to elicit some sort of damage as a result of that stretching, even really at a lower intensity. If we're already stretching a damaged muscle, it's probably not going to do it much good. So having said this, you certainly can stretch after your training session if you want to use that moment to help improve your range of motion and indeed your strength through your range of motion. But more important for recovery are things like, getting some glucose into your system very early, hydration, sleep, good nutrition, all those things. So yeah, avoid stretching post-session if you think it's going to help you with your recovery, because it doesn't. I had a cricket player that I was working with who his throwing was just off. He was losing range. Things just didn't feel great for him. And there was a few things going on, but one of the things that wasn't happening for him, his pec was very tight. Research has shown that when your pec is tight, it throws around your whole throwing mechanics. So we see things like opposite hip recruitment and scapular movement, dyskinesis, things like this. Anyway, things just don't work. Research also shows that stretching that pec can improve your throwing mechanics. So I had him stretch before his training sessions, and he found that his throwing dramatically improved. And this is how we should use stretching pre-training. It wants to be targeted. So I don't believe in anything like a general stretch. We want to make sure that anything we're doing, both in our strength training, if it's relating to sport, our stretching, endurance training, cardio, whatever, it's there for a purpose. And that's the same for our stretching. We only really need to stretch before our training if we're trying to target something. Indeed, if we have a sport where we're working through large ranges of motion, we should do something to prep for that. But if we have something going on in our body where we need to improve mechanics, stretching can help that pre-session. If that same player had have put something in like arm swings or whatever, we just wouldn't have seen the same sort of results. We need to get a targeted, strong load into that muscle where we're also transferring load into the tendon. We can't do this through what people are calling mobility training. We can use that mobility training at the start of the session if we're concerned about any of that power sort of stuff, power losses we spoke about. So coming into a stretch, going into some dynamic stretching following it. But I think ideally we should be looking at our mobility training post-session, because that's going to allow us to increase our blood flow, and that's where we might actually be able to use some sort of stretching type activity to improve our recovery for the next day. So flipping it on its head a little bit, I would say targeted stretching pre-training, dynamic or mobility activity post-training. Quick recap, mobility is active, stretching is passive. No, and let's also recall mobility wasn't even a word 15 years or so ago. Stretching can be active too. Myth 2, stretching is temporary, not if done with enough intensity, and research proves that we do create some sort of muscle change with the right amount of intensity. Myth 3, stretching before training decreases power, only if you do it for a long amount of time, and that's negated by following it up with some dynamic movement after. Myth 4, stretching improves recovery. It doesn't. Don't expect to hit the dance floor after a heavy leg day, followed up with some hamstring stretches. It's not going to help. Myth 5, mobility before training, stretching after. We're going to flip that over on its head and have some smart targeted approaches to how we do our range of motion training pre and post exercise. So what's the takeaway? Stretching can be a very powerful tool when used correctly. If this video challenged something you've believed for years or you thought you had it nailed, please comment below, we can discuss that. And if you're ready to stretch stronger, you know where to find me. Grab my programs, my book, like, share, subscribe, all those things. See you in the next one.